Well, thank you. I hope you found the first foray into Lewis's The Abolition of Man interesting. And I think what he's established is that without a solid sense of right, we have no recourse except to a very strong sense of might. And this is not a new situation. It's one that has been discussed at by various famous thinkers over the course of history, most particularly the man I've already mentioned, namely Plato, who discussed the topic of justice in his work, The Republic. If you recall, in The Republic, we get various definitions of justice. Now, one of the definitions of justice is that given by his friend Glaucon. And Glaucon states that justice is not a thing really, it's not intrinsically valuable, but it's valuable because it prevents individuals from getting into trouble. So justice is a thing that is pragmatically useful, but it is not something intrinsically valuable, and it isn't actually something at all justice, but rather it's something that simply keeps us from getting out of trouble. So he has a utilitarian view, we would say. On the other hand, in line with the view that I just suggested, that might makes right, we have his friend whose name is Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus says that justice is the stronger getting his own way. And that's a very common and cynical view of justice that we hear in our day. The rich and the powerful have the means of hiring the best lawyers and finding ways to utilize the law to get what they want, and we call it justice. And so he's describing in a cynical way the justice system, which does not deliver to us justice, even though we call it a justice system. That isn't, however, what we mean by justice. Plato responds, and he insists on this point, and he insists on it in various places. One of them I already mentioned earlier on in his Phaedrus. He defends a view of human nature in which reason looks to the good and to the just. This is consistent in all of Plato's works, same in Aristotle for that matter. And we will also see it here in the Republic, where justice is the topic of discussion. And the view, though, that might makes right, and that justice is simply what those who are strongest get for themselves so they get publicly vindicated, that is a very cynical view, but you could say that's the way of the world. We certainly hear that very often. To some degree, that's what Lewis is presenting to us here at the outset of this work, The Abolition of Man, as the view of Gaius Anticius. When we speak of justice, we're speaking of something that we value, or that we only call our subjective preferences. We call it justice, but it is something that we value, but rather than actually being just. Lewis says this is plain and utter nonsense, and that it is an impossible position, and nonetheless one that he's seeing increasingly commonly in his day. Now, when I say increasingly common in his day, the book is published in 1943. He's writing in the context of England during the Second World War. He fought in the first, but he is in Oxford in the second, and he is becoming a public figure, delivering these lectures for the Abolition of Man. They're called the Riddle Lectures. They were delivered at the University of Durham, where I studied, but up in Newcastle. And he was also famous for his radio talks, which eventually became the book that you all know, I think, called Mere Christianity. Now, Mere Christianity argues along much the same lines as we find the Abolition of Man. He argues from this notion of natural law and comes to other positions from it. But in terms of the context between the first two world wars, whether in England or whether in Germany or whether in the United States, is one of a great deal of soul searching and really a great loss of faith. Christian nations warring in trenches for 4 years for reasons that become almost impenetrable afterwards, after the fact, if you study the First World War at all. lead to the death of the whole sense of progress that preceded the First World War, and to some degree actually precipitated it. The idea that the nations, the war would be very quick, and ultimately every nation believed that it had the technology to win the war quickly, because their nation was the nation that God had favored. And there were a lot of sermons preached from pulpits to that end. When that did not come about, and we had mass warfare in trenches over very small plots of land in Belgium somewhere, and the eventual destruction of millions of lives over pretty much nothing, ending with the Treaty of Versailles, we had a great deal of lassitude and moral apathy and cynicism set in, and a great deal of dissatisfaction with God for not honoring what the preachers seemed to be stating would be a self-evidently good thing, in which their people would be victorious because their cause was the just cause. This was preached on all sides. But you will see in the Weimar Republic, a culture of moral relativism sinks in. And Lewis is describing the same thing in his own country. If you study England in the 1920s and 1930s, you see a country that has been broken by the war and lost untold numbers of young men for reasons that are unclear, and the victory is nothing like satisfactory, and then they go at it again. But this period leading up to the war is that in Germany called the Weimar Republic. And there's a man by the name of Alan Bloom who wrote a book that I read back when it came out in 1988. The Closing of the American Mind, he called it. This is quite a brilliant book. And it draws upon many of the same context in America, where Bloom was writing his book, as we find here, Lewis writing his own book on education in the context of the English upper form schools. So in other words, high schools, grades 11, 12, so forth. And he argues that there is a great deal of commonality between the United States and the Weimar Republic, because the only value he sees, says Bloom, in the universities of his day is that of openness, a willingness to entertain any idea. And behind this willingness to entertain any idea, to include any, and in our day, the languages of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is the non-judgmentalism, and the sense that what we call right and wrong is simply our subjective preference towards those things. So Lewis, and I'll read a little extract from Mere Christianity here, gives an explanation of the theological position of this. He says that what we call, there are two different ideas of God, he says. One is that God is beyond good and evil. What humans call one thing good and another, we humans call one thing good and another bad. But according to some people, that is merely our human point of view. Merely. Now that'll be the view of Gaius and Titius. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man, but you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer. It all depends on the point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous. A God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God is beyond good and evil, is called pantheism. It was held by the great Prussian philosopher Hegel, and as far as I understand them, by the Hindus. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans, and Christians. Pantheists usually believe that God fills the universe in the way that we animate our body. God is everywhere in everything, in what we call good and what we call evil, in the cancer and in the vital cells. We may value one or the other, but these are simply merely subjective preferences that are looked at from one point of view. So this sort of openness and this refusal to call good good and evil evil is the rejection of what Lewis calls the Tao. And what Lewis is at pains to do in The Abolition of Man is to demonstrate that by doing so, we are hollowing out our own chests, and we're rendering ourselves incapable of doing the things that we still want to do and still want to act upon. And he is now going to demonstrate in the second chapter, which he calls The Way, that every attempt to debunk these values which we say we want to live by and we appeal to ends up sawing off the branch that we're standing on. And he says it's of no use. And at the end of the day, the Tao is something that simply needs to be affirmed. It's not something that can be proven. We cannot argue deductively to demonstrate that the Tao is valid. We simply operate and live within it. And not only do we do so, we have always done so. The Tao, the idea of moral, objective moral value common to all humanity, is assumed by everyone and has always been acted upon. We will probably call it, if you want to use in Protestant terminology, something like common grace. Through common grace, men understand that there is such a thing as good and evil, and they act in accordance with it. They understand that the family is something that ought to be protected and held sacrosanct. Likewise, marriage. Likewise, the preservation of the human race. Likewise, the protection of the weak. Likewise, the honoring of our fathers and mothers. Likewise, the hospitality we will show towards strangers. These are universal human values, which we would call the Tao, because they are things that are understood, simply understood, and are the foundation of later judgments. We need to presuppose these things in order to act in accordance with our practical reason. Now, beginning in the Enlightenment, we could go back all the way to John Locke, who tended to think that a just society could be based on self-interest alone. But we could also point to Immanuel Kant, who wanted to get rid of prejudice, such that a later German philosopher by the name of Gadamer said that Kant had a prejudice against prejudice. He wanted to get rid of all prejudices because he thought prejudices were evil. We would tend to agree with him on certain fronts. There are certain things that are bad prejudices, but he thinks that prior judgments, of which the Tao is one, is ipso facto because it's prior to our reasoning is an evil. And thus he hollows it out, hollows out the Tao. And this leads, to my mind, to the Weimar Republic. And the categorical imperative lacks any substance upon which to feed itself. And we end up in the moral lassitude of the Weimar Republic. But in our own time, it leads to what we now call relativism. In our day, people will say that there are no standard concept of right and wrong or good or evil, and that all things are relative. In other words, as Lewis calls them, they're pantheists. And so moral discipline is not regarded as being necessary. And that's not because Bloom is a paragon of virtue himself. It's not because Lewis purports to be a paragon of virtue himself. He's not looking down on us. He's simply observing, in the case of both men, that objective moral values are necessary for us to be able to think and to operate and to act at all, and are of the essence, furthermore, of all education. And the practical result of education in the spirit of Gaius and Titius must of necessity be the destruction of the society which accepts it. There's a paradox here, because Gaius and Titius, like so many men of their generation in the 1930s and 40s, are pacifists, or at least would recommend that we not go to war and not fight for what is right, because what we consider to be right is a value judgment after all. And we ought to not obey those sorts of things, because look where it led to in the First World War. They have a point. It's a practical point. That does not, nonetheless, contradict the fact that right exists and right must be defended. This is a point that we will find in the writings of both Tolkien and Lewis, the two men. And if you want to read great illustrations of this, do read the authors, Lewis and Tolkien, on exactly this sort of thing, where the battle between good and evil is most powerfully played out. And for all of the debunking of the Tao, which we find in the educators of Lewis and Tolkien's day and in our own educational climate, we will still find that people's favorite authors tend to be J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis for some people. But certainly in the minds of the British public, when I was there in 2000, J.R.R. Tolkien was regarded as the author of the century. And he most certainly writes about a conflict between good and evil. If you're interested in that, again, I will be talking about that in my sci-fi subcreation course next semester. But on to the way, Lewis simply says that the way is simply that he can't prove, he can't argue to the point of first principles, because the Tao is the first principles upon which we operate. We simply have to assume it. And what he's going to do is in his appendix to this book is to show from various traditions, from the Confucian and the Buddhist and the Mohammedan and the Jewish and the Christian and so on, that they have very similar utterances, which all suggest a commonality, a recognition of the moral nature of man, and they simply see it as something that they are going to affirm, but they simply assert it. It's simply asserted. This is the nature of man, is moral nature, and we ought to act in accordance with it. They can't do what many of his era will do to try and debunk those moral judgments and reduce them to something more primal. And he talks about this strategy. They're trying to reduce it to something like instinct. Lewis observes that the word instinct doesn't really mean that much. It just means that an animal does a certain thing and we don't know why, and it does it repeatedly. So in that sense, the Tao is a sort of instinct, a moral observation, which we do universally observe. Nonetheless, when we say we, he notes that in his own era, this instinct, if you will, for moral goodness has been vitiated by the educators, or what he calls the conditioners. So the people who are tasked with the role of being teachers, historically understood as those who will first and foremost be the examples of this path of education, will say, follow me and do as I do. They are the very ones who no longer do that. They say, do as I say. And this not only leads to authoritarianism, but it leads to appeals to power, because they have no reason why you should do this other than I said so, do as I say. And he's seeing it played out in dramatic form in Nazi Germany, where people are following a leader rather than following a prime minister or somebody who is a first among equals and has his power checked. And leading to what direction? Well, whatever direction the dear leader says we ought to follow. Now, I mentioned, or rather had Dr. Scott include reference to a contemporary writer. No, I have the contemporary writer here, David Danielson, The Tao of Right and Wrong, very good book, Rediscovering Humanity's Moral Foundations. And it really is a takeoff on Lewis's The Abolition of Man. I recommend it to you. It's very good. He's an author who was professor emeritus at UBC. Very good author, 17th century specialist. And I commend him to you. But I had Dr. Scott give to you an interview with a contemporary Canadian artist, another one by the name of Shad. Shad is also makes reference to the Tao. and he is he's into hip hop. He's the host of Netflix's Hip Hop Evolution, and he appeals directly to this sense of the Tao and sings about it, and specifically talks about the abolition of man in the interview that I appended to this. And I'm going to quote him here. He says, I was reading The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, he says, and suddenly I remembered the abolition of man. In the age of surveillance capitalism, there's this idea of human beings as these sources of data, and we're looked at as the sum of these data points, says Shad. I was suddenly reminded of the abolition of man, which is philosophically looking at that same idea. What happens if we no longer see ourselves as something fundamentally sacred? Despite being written 76 years in a whole techno revolution apart, these works by Shoshana Zuboff and C.S. Lewis essentially attack the same problem. Both of them ultimately come down to the problem of what happens when we don't really decide that human life is more than you can quantify. Now, that to some degree that anticipates the third chapter when we get to the actual abolition of man and the theme of what I called at the outset transhumanism. We'll get there. We're not there yet. Let's still talk about the way, because he wants to talk about the ways in which the attack on moral value can take place. And one of them is by appealing to instincts. Another is by appealing to desires, as Freud would do, as the psychologists would have. These things that motivate us. Now, he's already acknowledged that those things exist when he talked in the last, as I did in the last lecture on Men Without Chests, in the allegory of the chariot. The one dark horse is like these desires, these appetites. And the other horse is, the white horse is like the thumos, pushes us in a rather different direction. And we find this also represented, by the way, just by the by, in Plato's Republic, where he gives a different picture. He imagines human beings as having multi-heads. One of them's a lion, and the other is a human, and they pull us in a different direction. And it's important, he thinks, that we obey the human head and not the lion's head, because the lion's head leads us down the path of pursuing our justice, or our desire for honor or for pride, which is what happens in most honor cultures. Whereas if we just feed the beast, then we simply become consumers and ultimately consume ourselves. So we have to feed the human head, says Plato in the Republic, and that leads to a harmonious soul and a fulfilled nature and a happy human life. And after all, when we're talking about Christianity and culture, that's what we want to live. We want to live in that way, and we want to lead others in that same way. So it can't be boiled down to instinct. And now let me read a little extract from the work here. Why ought we to obey instinct? Is there another instinct of a higher order directing us to do so? Like, why ought you can appeal to instinct, but why ought we to do, as a moral imperative, why ought we to do that? Is there another instinct and a third of a still higher order directing us to obey it? An infinite regress of instincts? This is presumably impossible, but nothing else will serve. From the statement about psychological fact, I have an impulse to do so and so, we cannot by any ingenuity derive the practical principle, I ought to obey this impulse. So once again, we can note impulses and we can note instincts, but we can't note a moral imperative to follow them. We can certainly note the strong desire. That's, again, the appetites, the dark horse, that we all acknowledge. Modern psychology acknowledges, so do those who appeal to biology. Of course, we have those desires and instincts. What we don't have is a reason that we ought to obey it. And this is the problem here. So there is an infinite regress in play here. And he says, even if it were true that men had a spontaneous, unreflective impulse to sacrifice their own lives for the preservation of their fellows, it remains a quite separate question whether this is an impulse they should control or one they should indulge. For even the innovator admits that many impulses, those which conflict with the preservation of the species, have to be controlled. And this admission surely introduces us to yet a more fundamental difficulty. Telling people to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people. This is a problem. And when we say we should obey people, well, people say different things. And so do instincts. And often they are in conflict. They tell us to do very different things, so do our instincts. So we cannot appeal to instincts to resolve why we should follow our instincts. There has to be a moral imperative that will guide us. He says this is the Tao. And the Tao is simply, we simply have to acknowledge as existing and operate in accordance with it rather than trying to replace it with something more basic. That strategy is the strategy of the pantheist. Those who think that good and evil, right and wrong, are simply matters of perspective. So Lewis goes after that here in The Way and shows that the way is something that we live in. So when Jesus says, do as you would be done by, and Locke says humanity is to be preserved, and all of the innovators' appeal for posterity or species come from these sorts of sentiments. It's not that his contemporaries aren't good at all. It's that they are not consistent with the principles of the Tao, because the Tao will allow them to think and operate. And this is the moral philosophy that is becoming more popular in our day, moral realism as a school of philosophy. And some of you may know something about that, those of you who are philosophers here. But he draws the following conclusions. Let me read it here for you. This thing which I have called for convenience the Tao, which others may call natural law or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, if you will. It is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value it is retained, it is retained. If any, the efforts to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. There never has been and never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. So in the new relativism, or in our day, the new tolerance, in which we will not tolerate views that contradict our own, in which we will say that traditional morality, in which traditional families, in which freedom of association and expression, in which right to life, these sorts of things that we would associate with the Tao, the life of the Tao, are regarded as unacceptable views. Then we are really trying to redefine what tolerance is. But by doing so, we have to appeal to notions of justice and fairness and civilization, which only flow out of the Tao. So we can't redefine these things without leaning on the very concepts which give rise to the person who's uttering them. They may be contradictory. We will be able to show them by showing that they have to appeal to the Tao in order to have this conversation. I think this is something we urgently need to discuss, and maybe we can discuss it now after this break.